All right, everyone, we will get started on our third and final panel for today. Our final panel today actually includes two speakers with backgrounds in psychology. We have Professor Rachlinski and Professor Murphy, and this panel will be moderated by Professor Rye. To begin, Professor Rachlinski's research interests primarily involve the application of cognitive and social psychology to law, with special attention to judicial decision-making, and he currently teaches at Cornell Law School. Professor Rachlinski has a bachelor's and master's degree in psychology from Johns Hopkins University, a JD from Stanford Law School, and a PhD in psychology from Stanford. His piece, Nudges, Defaults, and the Problem of Constructed Preferences, will be published in DLJ this spring. Professor Murphy's research focuses on the intersection of neuroscience, behavioral science, and law, and she is currently teaching at UC Law School. Is that correct? We changed it from UC Hastings?
UC Law, San Francisco.
Okay. Professor Murphy earned her degree in psychology from Harvard University and has a PhD in behavioral neuroscience and psychopharmacology from the University of Cambridge, Trinity College, in addition to a JD from Stanford Law School. And then our very own Professor Rye is the faculty director of the Center for Innovation Policy at Duke Law and is an internationally recognized expert in IP law, innovation policy, administrative law, and health law. From 2009 to 2010, Professor Rye headed the Office of Policy and International Affairs at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And more recently, in 2021, Professor Rye served as Senior Advisor on Innovation Law and Policy Issues to the Department of Commerce's Office of General Counsel. And I will turn over to Professor Rye.
Thank you so much. Really wonderful to be here, and my apologies for missing part of the morning, but it's delightful to spend time with you folks. And I will just start by having both of you speak for as long as each of you wants about anything you want to say on this general topic. And we'll start with Professor Rachlinski because he has a piece for this symposium and presumably, as a consequence, has very specific and directed remarks. And then we'll move to Professor
Speak
Murphy.
as long as you want. It's on anything you want.
Okay, well, I will be timing you, and after 10 minutes or so, perhaps I will nudge you.
Well, first, I do want to thank the people at Duke, the faculty, and the students. The students especially, I want to thank you for the 2 rounds of edits you've already done on my article. They're really good. I've done a lot of edits with law reviews, and this is in the top 5 in terms of its quality, in terms of improving the article, and how much work you've all done. So I really appreciate it. On the project itself, so let me say that it had an odd origin roughly 1 year ago. You might not know, Cass Sunstein is on Facebook. I'm on Facebook to post my vacation photos. Cass, of course, posts his vacation photos, which consist of new law review articles. And he posted a gracious announcement that he was privileged to be the keynote speaker at Duke's next symposium. And there was a link, and I went to it, and it said there was a solicitation for articles. And all y'all wanted at that point was 5 pages. I'm like, that's a Thursday and a Friday. And I sent you 5 pages riddled with mistakes, errors, bad judgment, and the like. And yet you accepted my piece. So thank you for that as well. And thanks for being on Facebook, Cass. You did social media. Who knew? The project, I hope, is not taken, particularly by Cass and others in the more squarely in the nudging field than me. I do a lot of research on judges. It's not taken as just a humbug kind of, let's pick on nudges project. I mean, to really improve the project in my own little way, if possible, with an observation rather than to pick on it. There are plenty of people who do pick on it and who are humbugs, and they're wrong. The fact of the matter is, some of the nudging papers and projects by the government are among the most effective and humane things that I have seen in social science in my 40 years of being a social scientist. Some of them are just remarkable in terms of how much they improve well-being. Cass has named a few of them. One of my favorites from the last few years, it's a professor at Wharton in criminology, Emily Ose, who she intervened with the Brooklyn courts in New York to send notifications to people that they have a court date coming up at which, if they do not appear, a bench warrant will be issued for their arrest. That's a bad move to not show up under those circumstances, but a huge proportion of people don't show up for all manner of understandable psychological reasons, right? Like they hope it'll just go away. They imagine doing something else. It's not on their normal radar screen. It is a hassle to go to the courts. They got to take a day off. They got to get that. But, you know, if you don't go, then the next time you get a traffic stop, you're going to spend 2 months in jail and your life will be a lot worse off than if you do show up. And then, yes, you'll pay a fine you probably can't afford, but you know, your life is just going to be better showing up for that court date. And a simple text message 2 days before produces a 30 percentage point increase in people who show up. That's an intervention the court system in Brooklyn has absolutely adopted now. And the lives of thousands of people are simply better off because of it. That is just fantastic stuff. All right, so my little quibble then, given how wonderful, and then there's just hundreds of projects like that, and it's very uplifting to read them. My little quibble is, well, and it's sort of akin to the question I asked of Shalom Tor earlier. Most of the nudges, it seems to me, in many cases at least, are ones in which you kind of already know the outcome. Like, I gave away the story about Professor Aus's study. You should show up. I mean, you can imagine the circumstances in which someone's elderly grandmother is dying that day, and they should probably skip it and try to figure out how to fix it later. But for virtually everybody, they're just going to be better off showing up for the court system. Virtually everybody's better off not smoking. I imagine there's someone somewhere for whom their life is better smoking, but it's very hard to believe. So many times we already kind of know the answer ahead of time. And my paper sort of comes at it, that idea, from the reverse direction, which is, in a way, it's more a critique of cost-benefit analysis, that if you do a nudge, you're actually going to change people's preferences. You're going to change what they value. And so it's awfully hard to do cost-benefit analysis if what people value is shifting. So, you know, Cass and others have said, well, when we do the cost-benefit analysis, if there's, you know, a minority of people, but who really value the thing they're doing more, the home energy reports or what have you, and everybody else has made a little less off, then you ought to do it, because on net benefit, you know, that's a good idea. The thing is that getting those reports actually can change how people think about them. And in the paper, I use the example of having an electric vehicle hook up at a new home construction. Right now, you have that choice. You can put one in or not, and you have to sort of predict whether maybe you own an electric vehicle already, so you'll want one. Maybe you think you might buy one, so you kind of want one, or maybe you don't think you're going to buy one anytime soon, so you might not want one. And there are pros and cons to it. But if we change the default to say, well, look, we're going to put them in new homes, but you can opt out, which is a standard kind of nudge, my sense is that'll change the preferences about them. So that if we ask people, how much do you value the home hookup? If the default is it's not in your home unless you take steps to put it, you'll get a different answer than if that is the default. That's been sort of reasonably well understood in the nudge literature, I'm not written about. In the paper, I go on a little further to think about some of the ways nudges work are so invisible, not in the, gee, we don't know what the government's doing, non-transparent sense, but kind of invisible to the person, that they can't help but think about it differently. And they remind me of some older studies in social psychology, early cognitive dissonance studies, one of my favorites from Stanford, of course, where what they did is they had subjects come in and do this really tedious task, spool packing. They put spools in a little drawer and then pulled the bottom out of the drawer, the spools fell out, and they did it again for an hour and a half. It's really boring. And then they had them leave and meet another subject, ostensibly, it's actually Confederate, and they asked the subject to tell the Confederate that the task is really interesting, which is not true, really boring. And they did one of two things. They either paid them $1 to lie about it or $20 to lie about it. And what they found later, they then later asked, well, how interesting was it really? And they all said it was boring. But the ones who were paid $1, of course, said it was really boring, even though they had told people, oh, I've got it backwards. The ones who said it were paid $20, of course, said it was really boring. The reason they lied, of course, was the $20. The ones who were paid $1 said it was, you know, was boring, but kind of interesting. They changed their at least stated preferences. Why? Because, well, they didn't really know why they said it was interesting. I know why they said it was interesting. They did so because they were asked to. Like, people tend to be kind of compliant. But the dollar masked their motive, right? So no one lies like that for $1, but they would lie like that because someone asked them. But when you give them the dollar, it masks why they really did it. So when people kind of don't know why they do things, it really alters their affective perception of that thing. And a lot of nudges kind of work that way, which makes it really difficult to do the cost-benefit analysis because you don't know what the preferences are, and they keep moving. So in a way, what my little, addition, if there is one to this project, is to say, we really ought to nudge when we already know we want people's behavior to change. That it's awfully hard to do a kind of a neutral cost-benefit analysis when you've got these shifting preferences, and nudges kind of make that transparent. So that's where I am.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask one follow-up question. This is a little bit off script, so apologies if it's too off script. So given the shifting preferences and the difficulty of really pinning down anyone's preference at any moment in time, and the related sort of sets of questions regarding replication of social psychology experiments, is this a tractable exercise at the end of the day to really
Cost-benefit analysis at all?
Oh, cost-benefit analysis of people's preferences in terms of kind of monitoring them over time without actually changing them through the experiment itself. I mean, because I think you're saying you don't want to change them through the experiment itself, but you do want to monitor them. Question mark?
I'm thinking that here that it's hard. Well, look, cost-benefit analysis, like nudging, and actually even more so, is here to stay. It's a core part of how the government functions, and for good reasons. A lot of them my colleague Jed Stiglitz identifies. It's one way of reasoning through, whether something's a good idea or not. But it is kind of radically imperfect in lots of ways, particularly when it gets at when it tries to get at what people really want. For example, to me, in a way, I just sort of don't trust it in the same way. So one of the, and where does it come up? He's not here to defend himself, so I can pick on him. Avishai Tor has a thing in one of his papers about people, and I think Cass mentioned it too, that people don't want to pay for the home energy reports. A lot of people don't. Some people do. But a lot of people don't want to pay for them. I don't care. I just really don't care. Like, I don't think that preference to not be willing, when you ask people how much you're willing to pay for a home energy report, I got to say I think that's mostly nonsense. On a sunny day, it might be different. On a warm winter, it might be different. If you ask, oh, by the way, it's a default that you're going to get it, you're going to get a different, I just don't think the number is meaningful. Cost-benefit analysis in a way works best when it's compared to something else or when the differences are very big. And again, it is a good way of reasoning through and listing out what the cost, because there is a real cost there to giving people information they don't want. But I don't know that I trust the numbers so much. So I worry that in a way that there isn't a neutral way of evaluating nudges, right? I'm willing to say, I don't care what nudge you use to get people not to smoke. I think the misery and suffering that it inflicts on people is sufficient. That taxes, ugly symbols, text mess, I don't care. And use whatever's cheaper and most effective. That's fine with me. And I don't feel the need to do the cost-benefit analysis afterwards, in part because I think I know where the cost-benefit analysis is going to go. It's just not, it's not a behavior that's in anyone's interest. But again, that obviously there's some value judgment going into that, right? I'm not valuing some libertarian notion that you should be free to kill yourself, basically drown in your own liquids when you're smoking at an age 60, 65. I think that's wrong. And some of my value judgments go into that, but I think that's okay. I don't have an objection to that. I think we make political and value choices.
All right, Professor Murphy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for including me in this symposium. I've learned a lot today. It's really nice to come in, especially because I think I'm an outsider. So thank you, students, for being willing to hear this perspective. And just for context, I am not an administrative law scholar by training. I'm a behavioral neuroscientist by training. And I have been writing in the last several years about neuroscience and law, which has been spending a lot of time in the domain of criminal responsibility, questions of philosophy, and about technology, and I write about evidence, use of brain scans in court and things like that. And all of that has had a rather narrow focus, both in terms of what we know from the science, but also in terms of how many people's lives it applies to. And I'm a behavioral scientist by training, in part because I am deeply interested in how our brains work, how they work together, and how those mechanisms really mean that we can flourish. And so I think that a lot has been done in law and neuroscience. So my work that I'm going to tell you about that is relevant to administrative law is trying to push the law and neuroscience super specialized subfield into a much broader direction that has an impact on a lot more people's lives, which is when I took administrative law from Dan Ho, I thought, oh, this is how the world works. Okay, so that brings me to the behavioral law and economics and nudging paradigms. And so I come as a critic, but also bearing gifts, I hope, of a broader idea and paradigm to shift to. And that's the idea that I call collective cognitive capital. And it comes from a couple of different perspectives, but the two that are really relevant here are one that we've heard a lot about today of how nudges and behaviorally informed interventions are critically limited in some ways. The time cost-benefit analysis assessment is difficult for me, particularly. I think choosing what period of time do we evaluate this over? Subjective preferences are dynamic, baselines change, our preferences are constructed all the time, not just in sort of state-based ways, but in trait-based ways. Like these things are constantly in flux. They're also, I think, somewhat limited, although less so with what I call kind of nudge 2.0, like the move towards sludge and administrative burdens and time taxes, in that they have been focused very much on individuals and on modifying individuals' behaviors to get towards a particular set of ends, right? We're trying to get people to do things on time, to do things that are good for them, to make better choices. And that this might sort of crowd out in political context, like actually thinking about different systems and whether we should be asking people to make these kinds of decisions at all. So to go back to my question to Dan and to Gabe earlier is, do we want to live in a system where people have to make really difficult choices about retirement allocations? I don't even know how to do this. I'm an extremely highly educated person. I have like a weird partial pension, and I still don't know how to do this. Or should we have a different political question that instead of getting individuals to like work best within the system, should we have a different system entirely? So I think there's a strong extent to which the extremely popular paradigm of nudging and behaviorally informed interventions has been kind of a handmaiden to a certain political economy without leaving a lot of room for questioning that political economy. That's, I think, starting to shift and change as the focus becomes more on how these types of insights should affect the design of institutions rather than trying to affect the behavior of individuals. So that's one perspective. The second is from the science. I think that we should be making use of a much broader swath of behavioral and brain science to better humanity. That the paradigms of behavioral law and economics so far have focused largely on judgment and decision making, which is obviously the kind of final common pathway. When you're talking about behavior, you're talking about output, observable behavior. I also care about internal mechanisms, and there's the interesting question of how much does it matter what's going inside the black box of our brain. But we know a lot and should care a lot because it affects people's lives about things like cognitive scarcity, executive functioning, attentional bandwidth, inhibitory control, emotional regulation, development and plasticity, resilience in the face of stress and trauma. These are things that brain and behavioral science tell us a ton about that I don't think our current behaviorally informed policy paradigms incorporate, and don't have models for incorporating things like the effect of stress, toxins, nutrition, biological influences, that I think we should broaden the scope of the relevant data. And I think we can do this in a frame-shifting way. And the biggest frame shift for me would be, instead of having behaviorally informed policy or behavioral law and economics focus on ends and arguing about what those ends are. Is it subjective well-being? Is it hedonic preferences? Is it meaningfulness? Or is it avoidance of distress. Like, what are these things? And especially for me, because those things change over time, right? In a given individual from hour to hour, but also over the course of years. I think we should focus on the means. And I think that behaviorally informed governance, both from legislative as well as regulatory kind of tools, should focus on developing what I would call the collective cognitive capital of the people. And for regulatory issues, asking, does this particular policy implementation kind of absorb, like take more collective cognitive capital than it should from the people? Does it waste their time? Does it put, and it has distributive components, does it put additional administrative burdens on those who have the least cognitive capital, collective cognitive capital, which we know are folks who are already marginalized? And so one, we should be acting to bolster this in whole, and two, when we have to intervene in people's lives, can we do it in the way that preserves collective cognitive capital? Because it is a normative and inherently valuable good. And it is, I think, the thing, I think that Dan will agree with me here, although we're just talking about this for the first time. It is the thing that a surplus of what we would call, I'm calling it capital quite deliberately, right? It's a resource. It's a resource that if we do invest in it in terms of education, there's lots of pieces of law that already fit in here in policy. But if we treat it as a valuable resource, the surplus of this resource is what can lead to democratic self-governance and autonomy down at the individual level. But if we focus on the means rather than getting people to behave a certain way in terms of the ends, I think we actually solve some, not all, but some of the problems that are just going to be persistent with cost-benefit analysis, and especially for me, the time horizons issue, the adaptation issue, the flexibility with which we move through the world because of the incredible power of our cognitive bandwidth. And cognitive has a capacious meaning here. CCC sounds good, but it includes emotional regulation. But I think that it asks a broader question than, what if nudges make people feel emotionally bad right now? Well, maybe I feel bad because popcorn is ruined right now, or maybe I feel bad because my calories are ruined right now, but over a longer period of time, our behavioral impacts or self-efficacy impacts or the ability to metacognate and realize that's why you're being given this information, those things require cognitive capacity and capability. This is largely an operationalization, I think, of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach, which is really popular in development economics, but it's been hard to operationalize. I posit that brain and behavioral science can actually help us operationalize this. I'm happy to talk about that more, but that's my pitch, that we should actually shift the frame towards means rather than ends.
Can I ask Emily a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, Arti.
Sure, absolutely, go for it.
On the popcorn and warnings thing, I wasn't sure which way we were going to go, and I'm still not 100% sure. So a world in which there are lots of warning labels to things that we can't, some of us can't resist. It sounds like a world in which we're less happy and more miserable. So everywhere I turn, I wrote a tongue.
Only if you attend to it.
Well, but I mean, the point of the warning label is so you attend to it. I wrote a sort of tongue-in-cheek article a few years ago about one of Cass's books that, welcome to the Republic of Nudge. You go home, you open a beer. It used to be more fun when it didn't have a diseased liver on the bottle, but you know, it's still a beer and you're gonna drink it. You open your mail and there's like a thing from your water company with a smiley face. You're like, great, showering with my spouse is saving water, this is good. You open your gas bill, you go, ooh, frowny face, better turn the thermostat down. You're glad you voted because you made a pre-commitment plan, but now you're late for dinner, so you want to have a pre-prepared meal, but those aren't as good for you. Look at the label on it. I mean, welcome to the Republic of Nudge. Much happier than the dictatorship of no, but am I more miserable now? Just generally, because it does feel like a collective cognitive burden the more labels we've got. But I heard you to go the other way, which I thought you might too, which is, I don't know, when I go to your friend Cass who has had popcorn ruined, really every time they go to the theater, like oh no, again I learned that.
So,
which is it? Is it the adaptation or the just collect? I mean, because enough misery can make you miserable.
Enough misery can make you miserable. I think that, but to go back to my first reaction, which is that information only has emotional impact if it's attended to and if it's salient. And maybe the first few exposures, it's going to be attended to and salient. Beyond those first few exposures, there's a lot of adaptation and habituation to them. We know that those things become normalized and less salient, and particularly so for folks who have metacognitive abilities to say, you know, I'm just not going to pay attention to that. I'm just going to, I actually don't, I degaff, I don't care what my electricity company puts on their bill. Like, it's just not, it's not important to me. And people who, and there's some degree, I think, of like education about how these things are working. You can touch that side to engage with these nudges or not. But I think there's also some degree of being an active agent, which in my theory of how behavior works, the perception of agency, not just over the information that you receive, but how that, whether that information is tagged as salient or not, is the source of a lot of meaning as well as well-being, but really meaning, like the sense of agent, the sense of being an agent and the sense of having some control over one's internal state because of the ability to filter external stimuli is, I think, missing in a lot of mental health issues, and its presence provides a great deal of satisfaction, especially over time, but even in the moment. So I think those things are fine, but if you equip people with more cognitive bandwidth to say, is this something I actually want to care about? And making an agential choice whether or not to, you may not need the targeted nudging. You may be able to say, okay, people who are like, actually, I do want to care about this because it's in line with my values to care about the environment, or actually, I do need to care about this because I care what Joey neighbor thinks of me. Or you say, you know, fine, I'm moving on, right?
So one question to both of you, which returns us a little bit to the administrative law theme as well, from the standpoint of the regulator. So can the collective cognitive capital approach be applied to regulators as well? Can regulators be better as a consequence of C cubed? You know, so if we do move to, say, a different kind of political economy where these questions are not a matter necessarily of individual choice, but a matter of collective action by the group, the democratic group that has elected the regulators, but elected the people in office, and you know, presumably the regulators have some democratic accountability. Can all of that then, all of those concepts be applied to regulators as well?
I think so. I think the interesting question for how this concept applies to regulators is how are regulators going to implement it? Like, there's different options, one, all of which need to be explored. One would be something like cognitive impact statements, akin to environmental impact statements. It's like, what is the best guess of, based on research that we already have off the shelf, as well as experts, to the impact that this type of regulation is going to have, and how do we draw the boundaries between a particularly affected populace, right? Like, some of those are just going to be maybe expert judgments, but we know the administrative state knows how to do that.
Well, does it? I mean, I take it that Jeff has written some work, interesting work on, you know, the public choice theory of administrators has a certain model of the regulator. But I take it that you're interested in some of the psychological limitations that regulators have.
A little, but I mean, it was early on in the sort of rise of behavioral economics and law. Most of the focus was on errors ordinary folks make, and you know how that, or errors judges and juries make. And then there were a series of articles on errors regulators must be making too, all of which tended to be written by more libertarian folks who said, well, you know, if people are stupid, juries are stupid, well, regulators are stupid too. And in a way, I sort of wanted to react to that there's a sense in which the administrative state, and I think Jed's more recent work is in a way a better iteration of this. Mm-hmm. There's all manner of safeguards in the administrative state designed to ensure better thinking. So one of the difficulties experts have is they're overconfident, that they're more sure of themselves than perhaps they should be. But forcing someone to provide reasons in a context in which they're going to be reviewed carefully and their decision's going to be overturned if the reasons don't make any sense, is one that really drives out a lot of biases. So one of my interests was what aspects of the administrative state are ones, which I think is, in a way, a sympathetic project with Emily's, that the cognitive capital of the administrative state is vast and great in a lot of ways, because if you're
And
an
collective.
experienced, yeah,
Yeah.
if you're an experienced part of the EPA writing clean air rules, you are used to the fact that you are going to get sued by everybody,
Yep.
or whichever half doesn't like what you did, and you better be able to explain yourself. And one of the things you sometimes see, I don't make this an anti-Trump comment, but you saw in the early Trump administration, regulators didn't know what they were doing, changing things and just getting slapped around. The collective administrative entity that is the EPA does have a lot of really good knowledge about how to make a decision. And part of that is because of the judicial review process that forces them to reason through it, and the like. And that, it strikes me as it's hard to build an administrative state in a way that would be more reasoned. If anything, it's over-reasoned, right? The usual critique is ossification and slowness of the whole thing.
I'm going to endorse those comments.
Interesting. So C cubed applies more to individuals who are the subjects of regulation.
Well, if you were designing administrative from the ground up, you would worry about these things, but we're not.
Right.
We have an administrative state that has a fully elaborated set of judicial review and reasoning processes that are part of it for a variety of reasons, and many of them have it to do with reacting to public choice theory, the concern about capture. Right. If you're doing something because you love the railroad industry and you want them to be able to ship hazardous waste around the country any way they want to, you're not going to give that as a reason for deregulating or not adopting a regulation, because it's embarrassing and you'll get overturned. So you have to, even if you do love the railroad industry, you have to come up with something that matches the set of statutes that command you to probably incorporate safety. I don't actually know the railroad statutes that well, but I do know the hazardous waste shipment statutes, but they do require a certain amount of reasoning. You can't, in other words, the reasoning state in part was meant to deal with, in large part, to deal with capture, but it actually has these side effects of forcing, pretty good cognitive processes.
Of debicing.
Debicing.
Okay. All right. Good. Well, how about the approaches that Professor Sunstein has outlined, the 5 questions that regulators should be looking at? Thoughts, ideas, does that, for either of you, does that mitigate any of your concerns with respect to either focusing on the collective or, Jeff, in your case, the transience of preferences?
Well, one should be able to hold 7 questions in one head, plus or minus 2, so 5 should have gotten all of us. I think I remember most of them. I think the increased,
You can,
they're right there.
they're listed.
The increased focus on distributional consequences, I think, is really important. There's very little question about that. The one I think I disagree with you about, Cass, or I have at least questions about, is in the way that what Emily and I were talking about, which is how much, if I'm unhappy because my popcorn says it's some ridiculous number of calories, but I'm going to eat it anyway and be a little less happy about it, how much does that really count? There's a lot of annoyances in this world that, and labels that are, troublesome. To me, because we're going to be in airports today, telling me every 10 minutes that my luggage will be taken and seized if I abandon it strikes me as a complete nuisance and makes the airport louder and more annoying and the like. But in fact, that's way worse than popcorn in terms of its effect on my cognitive processes. But you are supposed to get used to this kind of stuff in a way. And if the benefit is, 1 in 100 people avoids eating some popcorn, they're a little thinner, a little healthier. If you really were focused on making people happier, you'd really spend a lot of time on health effects, because unhealthy people, if you are suffering from a significant health problem, it is going to have a big effect on your well-being, almost more than not having quite enough money for retirement or any of the other things. And so a lot of the health warnings, if they make you a little miserable, grow up, might be my, and you use the word unkind. I'm like,
Nice.
it's unkind not to tell me that the popcorn will kill me, if you know that.
It's the distinction between nice and kind.
Yeah, it's, if you just want to make someone, if you go to the movies and there's no label, you go to the person that, that popcorn you're eating is going to kill you, that's unkind. Or you're doing it to make the person unhappy and to just be a jerk. But, a government label to do that is meant to, it is, like the way I act with my kids. There's stuff I tell them that looks unkind, but it's not meant unkind. Like, it's meant to, teach them, and like, you can drive 90 miles an hour on the highway if you want, but it's extremely dangerous, and actually not in my car, you can't. And I have to tell them that, even if it makes my kid feel bad, because I want to save his life and the life of someone else he might get. It's not unkind. I don't think. It's unkind if the motive is wrong, but it doesn't feel to me unkind. And it feels like the kind of thing maybe we just don't count in terms of cost-benefit analysis, even though you could measure it. Like, an economists are good at measuring stuff. So I don't know that I would count it too much.
Difference between nice and kind, I noted that. So explain.
Yeah. Oh.
or whatever you want to say.
Yeah. I forget, this may have even come up in a Law Mama's Facebook group, which is now defunct, and I'm no longer even on Facebook, but the idea that there's a
You're
distinction
missing
between...
out. You get articles written on it.
Am I? I got it anyway. I got it too late though. The distinction between being nice and being kind is being nice is sort of targeted at someone's immediate reaction and feelings and emotions, and being kind is sometimes saying the hard thing because it's fundamentally motivated by really benevolent interest. Like, I'm gonna have to tell my kid, my oldest child is 9, I will have to tell her things that are not nice, but I can say them in a kind way. Like, you didn't work hard enough on your piece of music. Like, that's not a nice thing to hear, but it's absolutely a kindness to give your child honest and constructive feedback towards something that they can change, right? And so I had 2 sort of reactions and to Cass's 5 specific questions. Absolutely, I'm in favor of aggregate effects, although the challenge is drawing the boundaries about which group counts. And I think that goes to the who is likely to be helped and who is likely to be hurt question, also being potentially vulnerable to capture, right? If we do, who gets to define who the who is in each group, and then those can be subject to capture in just the same kind of ways that public choice theory says we already are. But the biggest reaction I had was to the intervention on people's emotional states. And I think about this, again, across the time horizon issue and the state versus trait kind of distinction. The parenting analogy is that I do tell my children, there's no feeling that lasts forever. Like, and I tell my students this too, when they come with massive disappointment or something, a really, really aversive negative feeling, it feels unsurvivable. There's no such thing as an emotion that's lasted forever. So given that that's true, how should we value a particular emotion? It's a teaching signal. It's a teaching signal to modify future behavior to the extent that it's modifiable. And it's also can be, when evaluated in retrospect, a source of personal growth and meaning. I think about this in the context of like post-traumatic stress disorder, but also post-traumatic growth. I think about this in the context of resilience, and in an increasingly complicated world where there's going to be even more hostile, negative, aversive, large-scale effects that are not in the control of any individual person, like suffering through a climate catastrophe. There's no individual behavior that's going to make that better. That's going to be suffering. But equipping people with resilience and the cognitive capacity to take on board their negative emotions and process them is probably a goal that is better going to serve the ends of human flourishing than like, well, we don't want to make people feel sad or scared. We don't want to do that intentionally, but sometimes making people feel sad or scared, like, going through the car windshield would be like really terrible for you, but over time it's going to change societal norms through mandates, but also through education, that these things drunk driving is going to be, you're going to maim or kill people. That make people sad and scared, but to Jeff's point, like, who cares, right? Like, that's fine. I guess the interesting question for me is, I'm not willing to say we never want to make people feel sad or scared. We want to make them feel safe. I worry about safetyism a lot as being a hindrance to resilience, because life is going to throw terrible things at us whether or not the government regulates them away. But where then should we draw the line? Should it be a time horizon? Should it be where certain people who are already more vulnerable should not be made to feel more sad and scared because they inherently lack the resilience to incorporate that emotion as a teaching signal towards future behavior. Because we could try to like tot up utiles, but I don't think that's pragmatically ever going to be a way that we can evaluate policy because because all the problems with subjective self-report and because emotions are truly transient. They are teaching signals, like very transient teaching signals. They are not traits. They are states. I would worry more about the impact on traits, but that to me goes to the fundamental question of resilience and capability.
Terrific. So I think at this stage, since we have about 8 minutes, we should go ahead and open it up to the audience for questions. And Cass, you should probably have an opportunity to respond to anything that you think is important.
Outrageous.
Thank you. I think we probably agree. So it would be preposterous to say that if someone felt sad at being told they were mortal, we should let people know they were mortal. But it wouldn't be preposterous to say that if we're doing a welfare analysis of the consequence of an intervention, that the negative emotional impact counts. In fact, it would be random exclusion to say it doesn't count. You might say that it's modest or transient, but if people have a horrific day every time X happens, that's part of the welfare effect.
But you put a $600 million price tag on telling people that they're using more energy than their
Yeah,
neighbors,
that's
is what I
surprising.
remember.
Yeah.
That strikes me as,
So this is data. This isn't me. So the data is.
well, you're right, I'm sorry.
We ask people how much would you be willing to pay for a report, or how much would you pay not to get the report. Now there are things we can say about the execution of the study. I don't think it's true that there's extraordinary noise. In fact, there's evidence there isn't. That the people who want the report typically want the report, no matter what day it is, and the people who don't want the report. So they're not, it's not random.
But in the way that,
It would be shocking if the median person's willingness to pay for the report matched the economic value of the report. Because so many people, it would be an amazing coincidence. Because so many people are going to say, I love that report, and I want it more than the economic value. That turns out to be a subset. But a much bigger group says, I don't like the report. It makes me worry about energy, and it makes me sad. And that seems to happen every time they get the report, by the way. So
That's very
point
surprising.
I think is
If they weren't asked.
okay, so crazy to say that the emotional impact of telling someone you're going to die if you keep smoking is a trump card against informing people smoking risk. But the negative emotional impact of any intervention is just self-evidently part of the welfare calculation. So why would you, if it was racist or something, or malevolent, then we might want to exclude it. But if it's not impeachable on that ground, why would we exclude it?
well, but you're converting, maybe I'll cheat by going back to smoking, right? So some number of people who smoke are less happy, I suppose, because when they buy a cigarette carton, it's now got a huge dead lung on it or what have you. And maybe I'll go ahead and concede that, all right, every time, oh, there's that dead lung again. And they're just as made unhappy about that. But of course, an economist and anyone who has to do a cost-benefit analysis, I suppose, converts all of those into a single unit. We could call it utiles, but we use money as a rough proxy for that. But the utile of that, you're comparing the utile of, slowly dying of lung disease, which whichever your family watches, which got to count too, and the whole 9 yards. They just, to me, they don't feel like the same thing, and yet they are in the same analysis then, right? So that because you've converted everything into a linear number, and they feel like different things.
If you do some X that makes people feel secure where they'd otherwise be scared, that is either a non-quantifiable benefit or it's turned into a monetary equivalent. That's standard.
I get it, but some of them feel so transient, like the popcorn label and the like, that I like, recognizing their existence and saying, well, look, if there's no good reason to do this and we're making people unhappy, that's unkind and wrong, and we shouldn't do that. But when your benefit is a long-term health goal, in which we do know people suffer horrifically from health illnesses, and I have to roll my eyes at the popcorn?
We don't disagree. Okay, so if you make cars fuel efficient, there's going to be a more rebound effect in the sense that people will drive, and that will eat up some portion of the economic and environmental savings. To ignore the rebound effect would be arbitrary and capricious under the APA. But the rebound effect doesn't, it's the magnitude isn't high. And so what you're saying is the magnitude is small. I agree.
I think I want to make a qualitative point, which is our point of departure, that the nature of it is somehow different. It's not, I'm not being fully formed point in a way, but it just, partly it's, if I live in a world of, so my wife worked for years in California in a lab filled with Prop 65 warnings.
Oh, they're everywhere.
And she go in and it's like a wall of Prop 65.
Every store you walk into in California.
And the first day she worked, it was like, ooh. And then she didn't know what Prop 65 was. We just moved there. And I explained it. Said, oh, well, of course, they're chemicals. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that stuff's poison. Of course, it's going to cause cancer if you're exposed to it. And it's sort of dissipated. But I don't know how to count that if it's just going to go away. There's something to it, of course. It would be arbitrary and capricious not to recognize that you have imposed this kind of a cost in a way. But the notion that if 90% of the people experience $1 worth of it and one person experiences all the benefit from quitting smoking, I think I'd still warn people.
This is why I think we don't disagree.
Okay.
I agree with what you just said.
Emily, did you want to add
I'm
anything?
confused where the disagree.
Okay.
I think that having been a behavioral scientist, there's so much heterogeneity, right? There's just so much heterogeneity across the population about for some people, it's going to ruin popcorn. For some people, it's going to be like, I'm going to enjoy this guilty pleasure even more. And for other people, they're going to be like, I'm going to be powered by the smug by not snacking all the way through the rest of this movie. Like, there's so much heterogeneity that why don't we focus on the means, like giving people the tools and capabilities and brain power to metacognate on the type they are. So they can either attend to this information or they can start to let it just slide into the background. We can be active choosers about our own attentional control to a greater degree than people think. Not everything, and then we can also be active choosers and we can pay active attention to our internal states and what they focus on. And this is the basis for cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Like, that's sort of the point. So if we permit people to become agents of with more ability to attend and awareness and a greater metacognitive abilities, I actually think that's going to promote human flourishing and kind of net out some of these heterogeneity problems.
So I realize that we actually have 10 more minutes in some respects because we started at 1:10. So fantastic, because there are many questions. The woman in the black, yeah.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting perspective. Professor Murphy, I want to ask you, I don't want to undersell your broader point, which I think is questioning the sort of whole concept of whether this is the system we should be in.
Yeah.
But between here and there, I'm wondering what your collective cognitive capital insight could offer to what we're doing with nudges and animals. So two things I was thinking. One, it sounds like you might prefer architectural nudges over educative nudges because of the cognitive overload. Yeah, so just talk about that if you want. But the other thing was, just do we have a nudge overload? There's this concept in information disclosure of disclosure overload.
Yeah, totally.
While we were here, I got a home energy report email.
Right.
And in 2 seconds, I didn't even look at it. And also, I mean, Professor Caspian in the last edition of Nudge talked about, I was just looking at it last night, talks about how when they first wrote the book, Professor Thaler got his first iPhone. So the 15 years since this concept was announced, is a time of the
Right.
most massive cognitive development. So should we, until, between here and dumping the whole concept of just focusing on behavioral economics and
Yeah.
interventions, what would your insights say
Yeah,
about
so I have
behavioral
some examples that I think that they can be characterized by the idea that folks for whom citizen-state interactions are extra burdensome because they have more citizen-state interactions, so folks getting welfare benefits and things like that, who also, by virtue of needing those benefits, by being poor, have more cognitive bandwidth demands and scarcity. So you see this, I have an example, the earned income tax credit is only claimed by 80% of eligible taxpayers a year, and it's not that the follow-up, cognitive costs needed to learn about the program are part of that reason. The follow-up experiment, I'm just remembering from the paper, a follow-up experiment targeting those potentially eligible non-filers doesn't result in increased take-up. Like an educative nudge doesn't work for those folks. What would work would be an architectural nudge to say, let's reduce this burden on you to make this easier, so that you are statutorily entitled to this benefit. And then by that, we actually will restore some of the cognitive bandwidth that you need by giving you more money. So I think architectural nudges targeted towards people who already have the cognitive scarcity problems in the first place is the lowest hanging fruit for this to cash out. And I don't remember your second question because my cognitive bandwidth is time.
All right, I think, Matt, you were next.
Yeah, great stuff. I'm like, so I take it, I haven't read this paper, but my response to the question, it's not a question of, roughly GDP is total income, right?
Right.
We know the GDP is problematic, it's just additive aggregate. So I take it your view is, cognitive capital like income is kind of a resource. We should look at the distribution, not just the So this conceptual question, so how do you think about, so is someone's cognitive capital just a matter of the hardwiring, the sort of capacity of the neurons, the capacity of the brain architecture, or does it include cognitive disposition? So for example, I'm not on social media, but I take it that social media or some social media encourages sort of short-term, more and more short-term cycles in thinking, right? So you're more disposed to shift from topic to topic, right? And one might say, at least in terms of sort of deep thinking, that's a bad thing. So with that, so is the effect of social media on the short-termism or long-termism of your thought processes, is that a degradation of cognitive capital, or is that just a way in which the fixed cognitive capital is being used?
Yeah, it's a good question. The version of social media that I think is the degradation of what I would conceptualize as cognitive capital is the version where the attentional shifting is passive rather than active. So the ability to shift attention affirmatively and kind of use that spotlight in deliberate, chosen ways, as opposed to TikTok, TikTok, TikTok. I mean, I'm not on TikTok for this reason, because I know really, 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 really smart, wonderful people who are like, how did I just spend the last several hours? What happened? They were not an agent, they were not a chooser, and they were barely even aware of the kind of passive consumption of their attention, on which their attentional spotlight was there. The question of whether it has longer term effects in terms of the, not just the daily attentional capacity and bandwidth, but the longer term capaciousness of that bandwidth on a given day, like how big is that muscle overall that has to grow over time? I don't think we have good data on that yet, but I don't think it's going to be good. Yeah.
Not the capacity of disposition. I'm given capacity,
Yeah.
but I might be disposed to use it in certain ways as opposed to other ways, and that may be hard to shift, right? So
That's an interesting question that I had not considered yet, Matt. Like the disposition. I don't know how.
Capital degradation or enhancement, or is it something else?
I don't know how disposition is operationalized into the kind of terms that I would understand it as like a behavioral scientist. So I think I need to unpack that a little bit further. Yeah, good question, because I have to think about that. Thanks.
Great. And I think, Chris, you have the last word.
So Emily, I guess I have the same anxieties about your project as I do about gaming dance. adding extra welfarist contributions to our thinking about regulation, because I fear that they're just going to be deregulated, right? That they will be used on behalf of people who will say, sorry, Cass, that's a great idea, helping people save money for the future, but rather than give them actual capital, we want to give them cognitive capital. And so what we're going to do is make sure they try really hard to think about whether they should be saving for themselves, rather than letting them actually save for themselves. And so I'm just worried that this will be used as a tool for the deregulatory agenda. No, we've just got to toughen up our intellectual capital and not
The sneaky thing about that is that it's going to be cheaper to give people the cognitive capital by giving them money than it is by let's educate them to it's going to be, in terms of actual effectiveness, I would hypothesize that giving people retirement security and freeing up that cognitive bandwidth of their life is going to be much more effective from an investment standpoint than just work harder and save more money. That's why I think it's a nice Trojan horse for those types of political. It seems deregulatory, but I think ultimately it leads to extremely progressive policy investments. My bigger concern is that it becomes decollectivized and individualized, and then we start to rank or prioritize people based on individual conceptions of cognitive capital, which is a recipe for extreme danger. But anytime you bring biosciences or behavioral sciences into policy, you have that danger is always present, but we must guard against it.
Great. Any final words from you folks?
No, I mean, I'm sort of sympathetic to that last point in a way that there were some early criticisms of libertarian paternalism as well, no, we need to let people fail because then they'll learn the capacity to fail. So, what you really ought to do is get yourself into a really bad mortgage, spend way too much money on that over 30 years, and then next lifetime, you'll get it right. And the criticisms, you can see the response to those criticisms. In a way, the cognitive capacity has that potential, but it sounds a little different. There's a bit of, we can expose people to some stuff. It's going to be all right. And we should, because they'll develop some resilience, but not that we should completely throw them to the wolves, because there's a lot of things, there's a lot of stuff out there that really sucks up a lot of cognitive capacity.
The thing that I worry most about is what we know about resilience at the neuronal level is limited. We do know concretely now that it's not that our brains are done when we're adults. Your brain actually continues to generate new neurons and plasticity throughout life. Learning is plasticity, all these things. That said, the data is just scary to me that certain degrees of childhood experiences, trauma and adversity, there are some folks who may never be able to fully recover in terms of, and I worry that as a scientist, if we're able to predict who has plasticity and resilience and who does not, that becomes a filtering mechanism to say, these folks who were so traumatized, underprivileged, neglected, abused as children actually are never going to be able to flourish. So forget it. That's terrifying. And I don't know what the science is going to come out to say. We may have, because again, the science of plasticity and resilience has been a lot of effort and not a lot of payout for decades now. But that's a huge risk. That said, there's a lot more resilience than I think the popular conceptions believe.
So you'll get over being told your popcorn is 1,000 calories.
Yeah, I'm done with that. I'm going to go have some now.
All right. On that note, we should thank our speakers.
And can we get a round of applause for all of the speakers today for the Admin Symposium? Thank you, professors, all so much for coming. I think it was a very successful 53rd Admin Symposium. Thank you specifically to Professor Sunstein for being here as our keynote. And thank you all guys for attending. I hope for those of you that are going to barristers, you have a great night.
Yeah.
And for the rest of you, have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.